fans of the world. It's me, Ellie Krug, Ellie 2.0 Radio on lovely AM 950. How are you? Happy Saturday to you. Happy warm Saturday. You are in Minnesota listening to this. You are sick of the weather. There's no other way to put it, because we have literally gone a week without the sun. The sun poked out a little bit yesterday, but today's supposed to be good on Saturday. So I'm thrilled to be back, thrilled to be talking to you. With a big interview is with Dr. Rebecca Thoman, who will talk about efforts to make medical aid in dying an option here in Minnesota. You will be very interested in that interview. In my C block, I'm going to talk about legacy. My work as an idealist, but the idea about legacy, okay? But here in my A block, okay, here we are. Here in my A block, I don't have a featured idealist. Life has been hectic. But I want to highlight, though, a column in yesterday's New York Times. So that would be a column on April 8th, okay, in the New York Times, titled, "Good Morning, How Did LGBT Rights Again Become the Subject of a Culture War?" It's by David Leonhardt and Ian Prasad Philbrick. It is a great, great column. It's fascinating, and you know, there's so much going on. I know, and here we are again talking about LGBTQ, and we'll get to particularly about transgender. I know that I might have some listeners like, I've had enough of this, okay? But I'm sorry, we are under attack. This article, okay, if you don't read any other, it's a great synopsis of what's going on in the country right now. It really is, and where things seem to be headed. So they write, Leonhardt and Prasad Philbrick write this, quote, "For a few years, the battles over LGBT rights seemed to be fading from the American political scene. The Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in 2015, and most Americans supported the decision. During the past few national campaigns, most Republican politicians, including Donald Trump, who called himself a friend of the gay community, largely ignored LGBT issues. One of Trump's Supreme Court nominees, Neil Gorsuch, even wrote the opinion in a 2020 case that protected gay and transgender workers from discrimination," unquote. So that piece starts out, hey, it looks like everybody, maybe it's all over as it relates to opposition. But Leonhardt and Prasad Philbrick go on to say that the, quote, "brief truce," unquote, over LGBTQ rights now appears to be over. And there now seems to be a, quote, "new boldness aimed at reclaiming the cultural landscape." What accounts for this new boldness? Well, some of it was an initial reluctance to attack LGBTQ people for fear of alienating younger voters that Republicans wanted to court. Okay? Because, oh, by the way, there was a Gallup poll that came out 2 months ago, finding that, like 20% of Generation Z people, okay, so these are folks born between 1995 and 2012, that 20% of them identify as LGBTQ, okay? So that's one thing, that the Republicans held off attacking LGBTQ rights beginning in 2015, But then the other factor had to do with Trump. While he was in office, those who were intolerant of LGBTQ people were willing to hold off on efforts to beat back the clock, because Trump was appointing conservative federal judges at a record pace. And that was placating them. That was making them happy. And those judges are now in place, okay? And conservatives are no longer content with pretending to tolerate LGBTQ people, particularly my group, transgender people. As Leonhardt and Prasad Philbrick point out, American public opinion is less favorable, more conservative on the topics of gender identity and trans rights than they are on marriage equality. So people are more, across America, they're more willing to accept the idea that a man could marry another man or a woman can marry another woman. and they're less accepting of the idea that this gender identity thing is real and that transgender and non-binary people have a right to live their lives as they choose. So that explains why we've seen nearly 200 bills targeting transgender people this year. And here's the count. As in the article, there are 14 states now that ban transgender girls from participating in sports, starting at kindergarten all the way up through the end of senior college years. So if you're a transgender girl, tough luck. You're never going to be able to play sports, ever, in any kind of institution associated with public funding. Then there are 3 states. Alabama will become the 4th. That will happen probably the coming week. 3 states have... hold on a second, Ellie. Get your show notes. Have enacted bans on gender-affirming care for trans kids younger than 19. The Alabama bill that just was passed this week and waiting governor's signature, that will threaten health care providers, I assume also therapists, with 10-year prison sentence if they treat a transgender kid. In their piece, Leonhardt and Prasad Philbrick write, quote, when should schools start to teach children about gender identity? Should schools be required to tell parents if a child switches gender identity at school? On several of these questions, Republicans see an opportunity to cast Democrats as out of touch. The right is using trans identity among kids as a wedge, says our colleague Emily Brazelin, who writes about legal issues. Brazelin points out that this political strategy relies partly on lies that seem intended to stoke fear and hatred. In Florida, for example, some Republicans have falsely claimed that schools' lessons about sexuality are really an attempt to groom students. That's the new phrase this year, grooming. Grooming. I'm a groomer. The people are, I'm transgender. I talk to trans kids and non-binary kids because I care about them. I want them to know that there's an adult that sees them and values them. Yeah, in some places I would be called a groomer. And I'm sorry, I'm not grooming anybody, okay? Just to make sure we get that out there. Then we have Florida's ban on talking Florida's ban prohibiting classroom discussions about gender identity or sexual orientation. The Don't Say Gay bill, this too is something that Alabama is going to adopt. And although not all red state governors have gone along with marginalizing transgender youth, okay, the governors of Utah, Indiana, and on Thursday night, Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky all vetoed anti-trans youth sports bills. The Utah legislature did go on and override Governor Spencer Cox's veto of the transgender bill in that state. Thus, it is possible here for some Republican leaders to have courage and resist intolerance and get off the intolerance and marginalization wagon train. Stepping away from the article, I fear that things will only get worse for LGBTQ people, and particularly for my community, transgender people. 2 things, listeners, are likely to happen in the next 7 months. First, the Supreme Court likely will gut Roe v. Wade. I know that hurts so many people to hear. I suspect that it will do that by reversing its prior acceptance of the concept of an inherent right of privacy, which the Supreme Court began to articulate, that there's an inherent right of privacy. The government doesn't have the right to intrude on private lives, okay? It began to articulate that right of privacy in the 1960s, beginning when it struck down Connecticut's law banning birth control. Do you remember that? I mean, in the 1960s, Griswold versus Connecticut, for my lawyers in the room, as recent as the mid-1960s, there were states that said women could not get birth control. They're illegal to prescribe birth control for women. Okay? So beginning in the 60s, the Supreme Court starts to recognize this right to privacy. It went on, and later on in 1967, in Loving versus Virginia, that to hold that interracial marriage, that laws against that were unconstitutional, okay? And then went on the right of abortion, that Roe v. Wade is tied directly to this right of privacy, that state doesn't have the right to intrude on a woman's life until a certain point when the fetus becomes viable. And then the right to sexual privacy, such as banning anti-sodomy laws that targeted gay men and women. That's Lawrence v. Texas. That law came down in the 1990s. And then finally, marriage equality in 2015. Marriage equality based on the concept that people have the right, okay, to live their lives privately, absent some compelling state interest. So once the Supreme Court declares that there is no inherent right to privacy in the United States Constitution, then we're back to relying on state rights. And at present, only 24 states have laws protecting LGBTQ people. The second thing that I anticipate occurring over the next several months is that conservative Republicans will sweep the midterms, both in the Senate and in the House. And with that, look for dozens of bills aimed at erasing any federal rights protecting LGBTQ people, like Title VII, which the Supreme Court cited in 2020 as the basis to prohibit employment discrimination against LGBTQ people. I can see a Republican majority in the House and Senate introducing bills to override that decision by specifically saying that Title VII, okay, does not protect LGBTQ people, putting it into Title VII. I can see that happening. And then I see, of course, President Joe vetoing that. But they very well could have the majorities to override the veto, just like what happened in Utah. None of this is at all good. None at all. Okay, go check out Leonhardt's and Prasad's Philbrick's article in the New York Times. Okay, that was the New York Times yesterday, titled "Good Morning: How Did LGBT Rights Become the Subject of a Culture War?" Again, become the subject of a culture war. Okay, thanks. All right, we're going to take a break. I'm going to come back with a big interview with Rebecca Thoman, who's advocating for a dignified way to die, and you'll find it very fascinating. Okay, you're listening to me, Ellie Krug, on Ellie 2.0 Radio. Hi.
I want to take the breath.
And we're back, Ellie 2.0 Radio. All right, everyone, this is now the time for the big interview. You know I try and do a big interview every week. And with me today is Dr. Rebecca Thoman, who is trained in family medicine and community health. She's been working in the realm of healthcare and public health policy for over 20 years. Her goal is to bring the voice of clinicians at the bedside into policy discussions so that lawmakers, people in St. Paul, have a better understanding of how their policy decisions impact patient care. Dr. Thoman, I'll call you Rebecca. Are you there? How are you today?
I am. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, well, welcome to Ellie 2.0 Radio. Now, listeners, we have Rebecca here on the show because about 2.5 months ago, we had Dana Nelson on. I know my regular listeners will remember. Dana is battling cancer very courageously. And I had her on the show because she had become an advocate for end-of-life options. And now, Rebecca, I'm having you on the show because you are with Compassion and Choices, and that's what that's kind of the underlying organization that Dana and I spoke about. And you're also with Doctors with Dignity, and I wonder if you could, first of all, tell us about those two programs and explain to us. I'm going to just kind of give you the Hail Mary. Explain to us what's going on in Minnesota right now relative to end-of-life choice care options.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Compassion and Choices is a national nonprofit. Our mission is to improve care, expand options, and empower everyone to chart their own end-of-life journey. We have staff in half the states across the country, and we work in a number of arenas. We do a lot of education and providing resources around end-of-life planning. We have a legal department. We also have an advocacy department, of which I am involved. And our advocacy, we do some federal advocacy work, and then also at the state level, what we are trying to do is expand access to medical aid in dying, which is really like the very first Oregon Death with Dignity Act. And so that is a state-by-state campaign to allow residents of the state to have access to medical aid in dying. So Doctors for, and I'll talk more about what that is, and Doctors for Dignity is an initiative of compassion and choices, and we are a community of physicians. We support a full range of end-of-life options for our patients, including medical aid in dying, and we also work to reduce healthcare disparities at the end of life.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Thank you for that really great comprehensive overview. So Compassion and Choices, national organization, but it has, Minnesota chapter for lack of a better phrase. What's going on in Minnesota? Tell us about that as it relates to medical aid in dying.
Well, we're continuing our efforts that have actually started back in 2015 to introduce legislation that would authorize medical aid in dying. So if you think of death with dignity, that's sometimes used as an equal phrase, but medical aid in dying is a very specific clinical practice, and it allows patients who are terminally ill with 6 months or less to live, who also have full decision-making capacity and are adults, the option to ask for and receive a medication that they could then self-ingest for a peaceful death. There's also a process that's in the law which requires 2 separate physicians to evaluate the patient for them to get a whole series of disclosures about all their end-of-life options, and a full assessment to be sure that they have capacity, et cetera. So there are some safeguards built into the law. And it is currently available in 10 states and the District of Columbia. So about 22% of residents of this country have access to medical aid in dying at the end of life. And we have a lot of information about how the laws have worked in other states. Oregon, of course, has had the law since 1997, so 24 years of information and data. And it's very clear that the law is working as designed in many ways. So, for example, who's using medical aid in dying? Primarily, the number one diagnosis is people with end-stage cancer, like Dana, people who are clearly have full cognitive capacity, but they are suffering, they're in pain, and they have just decided that they don't want to go through these final weeks or days of suffering and would prefer to take a medication that would allow them to go to sleep peacefully. They're with their families, gathered around. They can say their goodbyes and have a peaceful exit. And most of the patients who opt for this also are in hospice care, so they are receiving maximum comfort care. So it's not something that is just decided rashly. It is not something that's given to you the day you get your diagnosis.
Right.
These are folks really who, like Dana, they want to live. And they're getting maximum treatment. But when they get to the point where the treatment is no longer helpful, then they want this option. And then the second largest group who use this are people with neurodegenerative disorders like ALS, for whom we do not have a very peaceful way for them to end their lives. So they would have this option as long as they maintain the capacity to swallow, then they could choose medical aid in dying.
Okay. These are... as a matter of fact, just this week, I spoke with a classmate from high school who's dying of cancer. He's in hospice care, and I mean, there's a lot of course, and we have a lot of listeners who understand about the suffering from family members or dear friends. Tell me this, we've got 10 states that, and Rebecca, let me just make clear to you and to my listeners, I am 150% in favor of what you're proposing. okay, in terms of legislation. This is something very important to me as a human. The 10 states, what was the most recent state to enact legislation enabling medical aid in dying?
That was New Mexico, and they passed the law last year in 2021.
Okay. What's the closest state to Minnesota that has such a law?
I'm not good with geography. It's either going to be Colorado or Vermont. You tell me.
I think it'd be Colorado. Okay.
Okay.
Now, but I'm sensing, all right, so, Oregon and Colorado, and I'm sensing these are all states that, we can't get past the politics involved here. These would be states really with Democratic-controlled kind of legislatures. Am I right about that?
Well, they're primarily West Coast states,
Yep.
Southwest, West Coast, and New England states.
Yeah, I guess.
Although
Vermont
it's
is
also spreading to the Mid-Atlantic.
Vermont is actually a Republican state, but Vermont cuts its own path regardless of whatever is going on. Why do you feel? What's your gut reaction as to why this has been able to take hold in Western states, and let's throw Vermont because Vermont's just its own thing. Why there and not other places?
Well, when you look at surveys, they've been doing surveys on this topic since 1997, and we know that the majority of Americans support this option as it's described with these limitations,
right,
applying only to terminally ill folks. We know the majority of people in Minnesota support this. We've had a Minnesota survey, and it cuts across geography, age, and religion and political background. So all major political party affiliates support medical aid in dying. So it really is a nonpartisan issue. And my example of this is the law passed in Colorado in 2016 by a ballot initiative. Remember the election of 2016? So we had
right.
two candidates for president. One got 43% of the vote. One got 44% of the vote. The ballot initiative got 68% of the vote. So we know that this cuts across politics. However, with so many other things that the majority of people support, when it gets into the legislature, it can become divisive. But what makes a difference? And also, in almost every state where this has passed through their legislature, it has been done with bipartisan support. So the thing that really is important here is that lawmakers need to hear from people to know that this is important. It's tough because so many of our advocates are people who either are facing a terminal illness or family members of loved ones who
right.
suffered. And, it's not kind of the top of mind issue for people like climate changes. But the more we can get people talking to their lawmakers about why this is important, the more we can nudge them into action. And it's always the personal stories like Dana, who shared her personal
yep.
experience. That's really what changes the hearts and minds of lawmakers. And, they're all human and they're all feeling people. And I think the more we talk to them about this, the more they're going to understand the need for it.
Well, so let's specifically talk about Minnesota. I mean, last year there was a bill introduced into both the House and the Senate. And it died last year. Was it reintroduced this year, or did you not get the support to even get it introduced?
Well, the legislature is on a 2-year cycle, a biennium. And so the bills have been introduced, the same very similar version of the bill has been introduced every year since 2015. So 15, 17, 19, 21. And the same two lawmakers have done the introduction, which is Senator Chris Eaton, who is a nurse from Brooklyn Center, and Representative Mike Freiberg, who's a public health law attorney from Golden Valley. And these two have really been the champions. They've introduced it every year. We've managed to have, over that period of time, there have been 3 public hearings on the bill, all in health committees, and those have been done in 2015 and 16. There was a hearing. Again, we had one in 2019. COVID has had an impact in a couple of ways. It's interesting how it's sliced both ways. One is all the attention has been into dealing with the pandemic, and so many other issues have fallen down.
Right.
Down. But it's also really raised awareness for people about how difficult and painful dying can be. And so in some ways, it's really increased people's awareness of their need to plan and their desire to have options. So the bill was introduced, like you said, last year. It did not get a hearing. Part of that has to do with the fact that there are so many other things, so little time, which is why we need to increase the urgency of this, because, several of my really strong advocates have died without having this option, and they suffered, and it was not the way that they chose to die. So, it's a matter of making it an urgent issue.
Did any of your advocates take their own life?
Well, what they did was they ended up stopping eating and drinking. And so they went through that process where it took about 10 days, and they dehydrated. And that was the way that they could end going through that final process of pain.
But all the suffering during those 10 days. I mean,
and it's hard on families.
Yeah,
too.
For sure. So who's aligned against this in Minnesota? I mean, let's specifically just deal with this. I mean, as I was doing my research, generally on medical aid in dying, across the country, not specifically in Minnesota. But one of the things I saw was that, these kinds of bills have been opposed by the long-term care industry. I guess there is an industry for that. And I mean, are you finding that to be the case here in Minnesota?
Well, I want to preface this by saying, when you were talking about the voices at the Capitol who are in opposition, they are the leaders, and they don't necessarily always reflect the will of their members.
Sure.
So the largest groups that are opposing us are doing it based on their religious beliefs. So the Catholic Church and some right-to-life organizations. They believe, according to their religious beliefs, that this is just wrong. So, and I respect that they believe that. Mm-hmm. I understand if I was raised Catholic, I understand Catholic suffering, and more power to them. However, it's really important that everybody's personal values are respected at the end of life. And so the problem is when those religious beliefs start to enter into policy decisions that affect everybody. And so it's, even though you don't hear a lot about the religious objection, that's really where most of the opposition is coming. So the same groups that would also oppose abortion or gender reaffirming.
Yeah, or transgender people, yes.
Right. It's sort of that same sort of but those people don't represent most people. I mean, they are definitely, I compare it to guns. Most Americans want really sensible gun violence reduction efforts, but we don't get that, even though the majority is for it. So it's kind of the same thing where what the people want has to be translated into who we elect and, our representatives really standing up for us.
What's Governor Walz said about this? Does he
Governor
have any
Walz
formal position?
He's not made a public statement about it. We've talked to his staff, though, and they have all the information. We've continued to keep them updated and educated about it. And I believe he just, it hasn't moved anywhere, so he's not had the opportunity or the need to really come out with a statement.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm a big fan of Governor Walz, so okay. Well, so Rebecca, let's just sort of pivot here a little bit, all right? And I'd like to talk about you a little bit, okay? Because you started a career in as a doctor and in medicine and the broader range of public health. What caused you to pivot to do this type of work, this kind of advocacy work? And then I'll just throw it in because all my guests get this question. Do you consider yourself an idealist? And if so, why? So I know, a very broad question, but I think you can handle it.
I think, my training in medicine, I saw a lot of problems. And in medicine and as physicians, we're dealing with people one-on-one. And for me, there were underlying system problems that were creating terrible situations for patients, and I was frustrated having to just do it over and over and over again. And I think that's what motivated me to move up to the policy level where I could have an impact. And so I've worked on issues like tobacco control. That's a big one where, 2/3 of the cancers that we suffer in this country are due to smoking and bad nutrition and poor physical activity. So there's so much about our behavior, and so much of our behavior is rooted in policy, that's kind of what got me more interested in policy rather than simple one-on-one patient care. This issue just comes from, my clinical experience, having seen people suffer, and my own parents suffering at the end of life. It was a very different experience for both of them, and I don't know that either one of them would have wanted medical aid in dying, but I look at their situation and think, if I got into that position, my father died of esophageal cancer, I might want this option. So believe me, there's some self-interest in this as well. And I would note that, the majority of physicians also support this. There's a strong, small subgroup, again, mostly with religious views, who are against it. But most doctors are supportive. And there are plenty of physicians willing to participate, and the number of doctors engaged in this is really growing around the country as more laws become enacted.
So do you view yourself as an idealist? And I define idealist as somebody working to change the world for the better.
I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but, for me, it's like when I see something that needs to change, I'm like a type A personality. I just got to keep doing it. I don't like being told no. I'm always trying to find another way. So I don't know if that's ideological or not. I certainly have the values that I hold dear. I do believe, though, that we all share a lot of those values. They're kind of human values. And politics is something that kind of gets in the way. It can facilitate, or it can be a barrier to us reaching the goals that we have. And so, I just have to lean in and deal with it and to try to get us to where we need to be. And it's really the personal stories of the people I work with, like Dana, who keep me motivated. So I don't know if it's ideology as much as it is connection to the people who I think will benefit from this change.
Right. What state do you think is going to be the next one to go in favor?
Well, there are a number of
states
that are, there are a number of states that have been looking at the legislation, and it's moved through up to certain points. Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts have all had hearings on this, and it has started to move in those states. Maryland came very close. They actually failed on a tie vote last year. It's likely to be back there. Nevada is another state where it's come up and moved, but not gone all the way. So I think those are some of the ones that have had the most movement. The Midwest is hard to crack, and let me tell you, it's going to be either Minnesota or Illinois. So we're in a little frenemy battle here to see who's going to be first, because we know people in the Midwest want this. I think Minnesota has always been a leader. I would love to see Minnesota be first in the Midwest, but Illinois is after us for that title.
So, and so that raises the last question I have for you, which is, are you seeing, and do you have data about the number of people who are moving to states in order to have this option?
There is absolutely no data about that. But what I will tell you is that it is a very, very difficult thing. I think people were really made aware of that option back in 2015 when Brittany Menard, she was all over People magazine, and she moved from California to Oregon. Yeah. Her whole family moved there. I mean, the option to move to another state, leave your family, or first of all, you've got to have the resources to do that, and people don't. And second of all, by the time people even maybe are considering this, they're so ill that they can't move to another state, and they'd have to get a whole new care team. So the idea of doing that, it's really much harder than it sounds, and it's really limited to people who have the ability and resources to do it. So it's not very practical. Yeah. Some people do it, especially if they're in a border state. They may go next door to the state near them, but we really don't have any idea of what the numbers are. Okay.
Well, that's all right. That's very important to understand. Well, listen, Rebecca, it has been wonderful to talk to you, and I really, really want to let you know I appreciate the work that you're doing around medical aid in dying. Thank you so very much for doing it.
Can I give our website before I go?
Oh, my gosh. By all means, let's do that for sure. And if people want to donate, tell them how to do it.
compassionandchoices.org/Minnesota, if you want to see the Minnesota information. compassionandchoices.org/donate, if you'd like to make a contribution.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, listeners, please consider this, okay?
Thank you, Ellie.
Oh, you're welcome. Rebecca, thanks so very much for being on Ellie 2.0, and keep up the good work. Hang in there. If we get it passed, I'm going to have you back, okay? All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, listeners, we've been speaking to Dr. Rebecca Thoman, who is with compassionandchoices.org and pushing for medical aid in dying. When we come back from our break, I'll give you my C block. Thanks. And we're back. Ellie 2.0 Radio on AM 950. So check out, for sure, Minnesota Compassion and Choices. And do as Rebecca Thoman recommended. Go to your legislators. Tell them this is important to you. Tell them that they need to get this ball rolling. They need to get this pushed. Please. Please, and support the organization if you can, if you want to do a donation. So, all right, C Block here. You heard me talk when I was speaking to Rebecca Thoman about a friend of mine who is dying. He's dying of lung cancer, and I called him this week and talked with him, and he's in hospice. We had a good conversation, and I will speak with him again. I mean, yes, and it was, he's a good guy, good person. But in the past 2 weeks, I've had two other classmates die. This is the class of 75, okay? And I had to go back to Cedar Rapids for one of those classmates. Went to the funeral, and the place was packed. I mean, we're talking standing room only, and people, including two daughters of this man, speaking, about him and stuff, and I drove away from that experience with a couple of mixed feelings. One was I have a very small family. There are not many of us, and it got even smaller once I transitioned genders, and so I don't know whether I don't know how many people would want to come. So that's one thing. Okay, we don't need to talk about that any further. But the other thing is I started thinking about legacy. Okay? What kind of legacy do we generally leave? All right? And the funeral in Cedar Rapids made clear that that this man had touched people both at his work and his family, and just the stories that people told about. I mean, we were laughing as well as crying, but what's my legacy? Ellie Krug, what's your legacy? And it got so deep for me to have to think about that. I mean, I turned the radio off in the car and back from Cedar Rapids and started talking to myself. And then I've been doing some journaling since then because, I'm 65. Who knows, right? And I've concluded that my legacy is my words. For the most part, idealistic words, but the words that you're hearing right now, I don't know whether this podcast will remain after Ellie Krug is no longer on this earth. I don't know, but YouTube will have a lot of the videos of when we tape the show. But, there's my book out there and columns for Lavender and Lavender Magazine and Minnesota Women's Press. I mean, by my guess, there's probably 250, 300,000, maybe even more than that of my words printed in the world that people can access. And then there are interviews of me and all of that stuff. And I don't tell you this to make me seem like important or for aggrandizement or anything like that. I share that because to me it is important that I would have rippled to others. Part of it is with my story and what I lost in transitioning genders, but I also gained. Don't worry. I gained Ellie Krug, and the gain far outweighs the losses. But nonetheless, I need to make some kind of sense out of all of that loss, and that's partly why I do my work. But it's also about rippling and hoping that maybe in some way, what words you've used, or maybe the example you've provided by words or actions may have made a difference to someone else, maybe may have helped them in a tough patch, may have inspired them to go on when otherwise maybe they might have had more difficulty going on. I don't know. But for me, that kind of legacy is incredibly important. It is. My goal is to stick around for a lot longer because, listeners, there is so much I am trying to do right now. In the last month, I have talked to 5 groups of young humans who identify as LGBTQ through their schools at their gender and sexuality aligned. 5 groups is the most rewarding work that I could possibly do. I want to do more of that work. But at any rate, I hope that this was not too heavy. Okay. Of course, if you get Ellie Krug on the radio, you never know what you're going to get, but you know one thing that you will get, and that's heart. You will always get that from me. You'll also get a good dose of authenticity. Okay, that's the end of the show. I've got to do a big thanks to my producer, Brett Johnson, who had to do a little bit mouth today. Big thanks to Chad Larson, who runs this place, who lets this show be here. And I'm very, very thankful for that. And to you, my listeners, I'm totally thankful because you tune in all the time. I'm getting more and more people are listening to podcasts, and more people are, I'm getting people writing to me and saying they appreciate what we do. And so thank you. Now, between now and you hear my voice next, go out, do something good, have some compassion for others and for yourself, and make the world a little bit better. Will you? Take care. Bye-bye.